Good evening and welcome to State Library Victoria. My name is Sarah Slade and I'm the Head of Digital Engagement and Collection Services here at the Library. And our event tonight is being held on the traditional country of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners, and I would also like to pay my respects to their elders and to the elders of other communities who may be here tonight. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the policy pitch, which, as you know, is presented by Grattan Institute and State Library Victoria. I would particularly like to welcome the speakers this evening, John Daly and Sabra Lane, who are here to my right, Grattan Institute members and friends of the library. We're delighted to be partnering with Grattan Institute to present this series. I believe we have much in common, including a shared interest in big ideas, research and deep thinking, accompanied by an aim to make the outcomes accessible to a broader public. It's been a great year of discussions on topics ranging from climate change, tax reform, school education and this year's federal election to the state of our hospital care. And we've seen highly engaged and healthy attendances all year, including, I'm sure, this evening. We look forward to seeing many of you next year as we continue to present intriguing and challenging discussions. And I would encourage you all, if you haven't already, to join the Friends of the Library. You can pick up one of our brochures, which are available in the foyer, or ask our staff after the talk. Like Grattan Institute, we offer exclusive events to Friends of the Library. We also hope to see you at many of the other programs we offer. Our current exhibition celebrates 40 years of R Community Radio, and I encourage you to visit with friends and family and to attend the exciting activities and programs that accompany that exhibition. Please pick up one of our Summer What's On brochures and visit our website. And now to our discussion this evening. Grattan Institute are launching this year's annual summer reading list for the Prime Minister and for any Australian interested in public debate. The list includes books and articles that say something important about Australia and its future, and is a great selection of reading material for the holidays. I look forward to hearing more about them soon and how they illuminate some of Australia's biggest debates. I think it's fitting that in partnership with Grattan, the State Library are recommending a summer reading list for the Prime Minister and the wider community to expand public engagement in public policy. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers this evening. John Daly is the Chief Executive Officer of Grattan Institute. He is one of Australia's leading public policy thinkers with 25 years' experience in public, private and university sectors. He has worked for ANZ and McKinsey in a career that also includes expertise in law, finance, education and workers' compensation. Sabra Lane has been covering federal politics in Canberra since 2008. And has been Chief Political Correspondent on nightly TV current affairs flagship 7:30 since September 2013. Prior to that, she was Chief Political Correspondent for Radio Current Affairs from 2011, leading federal politics coverage. Before going to Canberra, Sabra was a reporter for ABC Radio Current Affairs in Sydney, as well as an executive producer on AM, The World Today and PM. Prior to joining the ABC, she was executive producer of Seven Network's weekly national news and public affairs program Sunday Sunrise. Sabra will also shortly be taking over as presenter of flagship ABC Radio Current Affairs program AM. So please join me in welcoming John and Sabra.
Thank you very, very much, Sarah, and we too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their elders past and present. Indeed, we'll be talking about the writings of one of them in due course. Thank you to Sarah. At Grattan Institute, we're really appreciative of the work that we're doing with the State Library through this policy pitch series. It's a real privilege, it's a great venue, it's a great audience, and the library has been a constant source of support this year, as it has been now for several years, and you'll all be delighted to hear that we actually spent about 20 minutes on Monday morning at Grattan Institute with myself and the program directors arguing about exactly who was going to fill what slot next year. And so the series will be back after we've all read everything on the reading list over the holidays. And if you want to, tonight you can follow the discussion with other audience members who find their phones more interesting than us on the at Grattan Inst hashtag, at Grattan Inst name tag and the hashtag policy pitch. So that takes us to the reading list, and Sabra, thank you very much. Sabra, of course, has agreed to do one of the toughest things that we ask any Grattan co-presenter to do. Normally you just kind of have to show up here and kind of talk about your thing and it's what you do for a living. For this event you have to read, well, 4 books and 2 articles, which is a big ask.
2 very meaty articles, I must.
Yeah, so thank you, and it's great to have you here, and I look forward to doing lots of radio instead of lots of television next year. So the first book that's on the list is...
Now, before we get to the first book, should we do a little explainer for everyone? Like, how do you come up with this short list? Do you have a long list? I know you have a long list because some of it's on the floor here.
So the way that we do this is that everyone at Grattan Institute gets involved. Indeed, we have a book club, and we show up on Friday afternoon and we bribe Grattan staff members to stay around with alcohol. And we all talk about the book that we have read out of the very long list, or that we're putting up for the very long list. There is a bell that gongs you out if it's obvious that that book is not going to make the list, and the bell gets used a lot. Because, of course, in order to come up with 6 and only 6 things to read, you have to read a lot of other things. A lot gets published in any one year. And we look for things that have been published this year, or maybe very late last year, and that have got something to say about policy and politics one way or another. And then we look for a balanced list. Look, we'll come to some of the somewhat unprepossessing titles in due course, but it's got to have something to say to politics and policy, and it must be well written.
Was it hard settling on these 6 items?
So it's always hard, and of course there is a long and complex voting procedure at Grattan Institute as to what should go on the list.
1% of the say.
Yeah, as it so happens, what happens at the end of the process is that I decide.
Yes, you do. 51% of the say. Excellent. Now it's the Prime Minister's reading list. Do you know whether Prime Ministers past do read it? And do you select with the person in mind who might be sitting in the big chair at the time? That's been a hard task in recent years. But
that's right, you wouldn't want to put it out too early.
No.
We kind of select things that we think would be appropriate, whoever is in the chair. I don't think there was anything on this year's list that's particularly apposite to the current incumbent. There was last year, but I won't tell you what it was. We do invariably get a polite thank you note saying thank you for the books, because we do physically send the books to the Prime Minister. We do know that in the past the Prime Minister has read some of the books that happened to be on the list. Now, whether there was causation from one to the other, who knows? As we know, correlation does not imply causation. Although one year we did have a book about Australian economic history on the list, which was actually a terrific book, and Tony Abbott said he had read it. And I'm not sure it would have been on his reading list otherwise, but who knows?
Okay, let's get cracking, shall we? On to the first book.
So the Phoenix Years. So this is a book, Art, Resistance and the Making of Modern China by Madeleine O'Day. We put this on the list, and someone, when the list got published late last week, someone rang me up and said, "John," they said, "a book about China." I said, "Didn't you know the Asian century is like so last year?" People stopping talking about China?
People are not stopping to talk about China at all. I found this was a really fascinating book because, I mean, barrels of ink have been written about, you know, pulling people out of poverty, about how much of an economic powerhouse China's become, about the strategic importance, about South China Sea. Yet this is an amazing portrayal of what's happened in China through the eyes of artists and writers. And Madeleine O'Dea is an Australian who worked in China for the Australian Financial Review and the ABC for more than 30 years. So it's also through her eyes as well. Why did you think this was a must include on the PM's list?
Well, I'm with you. I don't think the Asia Century is that last year. Clearly, China matters an enormous amount to the world and to Australia in particular. Understanding what is going on there is not always easy. It is another country, and it's not a place that's often easy to get really good information on what's it like on the ground. And this provides both that kind of on-the-ground view as well as a 40-year view. You know, it starts in, well, in fact, 40 years. It starts in 1975 or so. And over that 40-year period, of course, China has travelled a long way, both economically and socially and politically, and it provides you with that vista. And I'm, very firmly in that camp that says you can't possibly understand a country unless you understand its history. And this provides genuine social history of China from the ground up in a way that I think is very hard to obtain anywhere else.
It really focuses on a group in China called the Stars, some contemporary artists who started really in the sort of late 70s. And also it details, we all know a lot about what happened in Tiananmen Square, but this book told me about some history of China that I didn't realise before, that there'd been another uprising in the 70s that effectively had been airbrushed out of history.
And that people died in Tiananmen Square, not in 1989, as they did, but also in 1976. There's an extraordinary interview with someone who said, yes, I cleaned the blood off the Tiananmen Square pavement in 1976. So it's not the first time it happened. So, that kind of history. And then you also realise just how far China has come. So in 1976, you have artists in China who have never seen an image of an Impressionist French painting. And when they held an exhibition of Impressionist French painting in 1977, it caused an artistic revolution in China, 100 years after those paintings have been made.
Yeah, and it was it sparked a real creative wave in China.
Mm.
Yeah.
The other thing I liked about this is that it really, particularly with that kind of 40-year time span, it really gave you that understanding of the shape of Chinese history, and has a lovely image at one stage about the shape of Chinese history is like a wave. It goes up and then down and up and then down, and it's really very volatile. And you see that up in terms of flowering of artistic expression, a flowering of free expression, and then it all kind of clamps down again, and then it kind of gradually builds up again, and then it clamps down again, and you start to realise, oh look, after 40 years you've kind of seen this movie before, and this is a consistent pattern of how it's been working, albeit one where it isn't like it was 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, it was, not only was there literally no image of an Impressionist painting that an artist could find anywhere in China on access, but it was also a place in which simply printing 100 copies of a magazine, the contents, most of which were actually pretty tame, poems about flowers and things, that was a highly revolutionary, illegal act. Now, I don't want to suggest that China is a model of free expression today, but it's certainly not where it was 40 years ago.
And I know that there's an element in the book that really tickled your fancy, where some artists were displaying some material and there was a police raid.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes through the book is the way that inherently art, visual art in particular, is much more ambiguous than text, and consequently the kinds of things that would automatically be clamped down on if you wrote them down, you could create an artwork because, as the book says, the artists thrived in a world of ambiguity where the interpretation of the works was left to others, and they could always hide behind that ambiguity to some extent, although of course it didn't always work. So there's a lovely bit where one of the artists has made an image, and it consists of a Chinese policewoman, instead of holding up her warrant card or a police ID, is holding up a banknote. And he's just opened the exhibition. The police show up, literally, as the doors open to the exhibition. That's the first work that they take off the wall. And they tell him, and as he says, they thought that I was implying there was a connection between power and money, and they didn't like it, he told me. Then he added, I was saying that, of course. So, clearly art was important in terms of this continuing conversation about freedom and non-freedom in China. The other thing that I think you really realise from the book is, we hear a lot about, well, China is different, it's exceptional, the only way you could possibly govern China is through the Communist Party regime, democracy is not a kind of, just has no place in China, and you realise, no, there is a 40-year history of a significant pro-democracy movement in China, and you can airbrush it out all you like, but it's always been there.
Excellent. Well, we hope that that's on the PM's reading list.
Indeed.
Now, this next book, actually, it'd be interesting to know. Hands up who has read Stan Grant's Talking to My Country. A few hands have gone up. I know that you think that this will be a classic.
Yeah, I think people are going to read this in 40 years' time. Yeah. It's got something very important to say. I mean, lots of important things to say. And two, it is astonishingly well written.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my initial reaction as we talked about the process that we went through, my initial reaction was, oh, but it's so fashionable. And everybody's saying it's a good book, and, surely we should do something a wee bit more original, and, do we really have to put it on the list? And then I read it and I went, yeah, we've got to put it on the list. It's such a good book. You can pick up pretty much any page to see that it's well written. One of my favourite bits, he's remembering his childhood. And I remember pineapple juice from a golden circle can. I can picture the two triangles punched in the lid to release the taste of a world of possibilities. I was probably 5 years old, and in one sip, all of my senses were jolted to life. My small hands folded around the can. I can still smell that tangy, sticky sweetness. And then there was the taste, an explosion on my tongue like a bee sting. It's great.
It is great. There is a lot. There is a lot in the book that is very evocative.
What did you love?
What did I love? I have to admit, there are parts of it that I wouldn't say I loved. I felt deep anguish, and I felt deep anguish for him. I felt incredibly emotional when I was reading effectively about his breakdown overseas. He was diagnosed as having depression, but the incident itself and how he wrote about it, I found that difficult to read. And again, I'll read a part of it about him not wanting to be identified as an Indigenous journalist. I made a conscious decision that I would not be the Indigenous reporter. I railed against this straitjacket. I'd seen other black people embark on careers, lawyers, doctors, only to be marginalised. The box ticked. Aboriginal. This was career death. If I was to have any impact or to be able to tell the stories of my own people, I wanted first to be a credible reporter.
Mm.
He goes on to say that his time at CNN was the absolute pinnacle, but by the same token, that was also the time when he had, that episode and coming back home. But it is, there are parts of it that are, very, very powerful. People are saying that this should be on reading lists for students in secondary school.
Well, the thing that I think is really powerful about it is that, one of the many things that's very powerful, is that it enables someone who is non-Indigenous to genuinely empathise with someone who is. Like many very, very great writers, you get inside his head. You see the world from inside his point of view, which is an incredibly generous thing to do. And you see him struggle. I mean, for me, the central kind of struggle of the book is him saying, I've been born in Australia, I'm an Indigenous person, I'm part of a culture which has been treated appallingly over history. He grew up near a place called Poisonous Waterholes Creek, and the name does kind of slightly say it all. There was essentially fighting going on. The white settlers literally poisoned the creek or the waterholes, and a whole pile of Indigenous people died. So that's the history. And as he says at one point, the conflict doesn't end when the guns stop. The conflict keeps going on, and towards the end he talks about what happened to Adam Goods. This is still going on in some ways. And it's his wrestle with, well, that's the country I come from. My people have been treated appallingly, but on the other hand, my wife is non-Indigenous. This is where I live. This is where I'm always going to live. So how do I reconcile that history with who I am and with the other people who also live in Australia? And he's very upfront about saying, well, yeah, they also live in Australia. They are also Australians. They're also part of it. And ultimately wrestles with that history to say, well, this is where we are from. It's an incredibly powerful story of his own personal reconciliation. How does he deal with both the history and the fact that he wants to keep living here with other people?
There are also parts in it for me. I grew up in a country town where, Indigenous Australians and the rest of us lived, in separate parts. There wasn't really a reconciliation. That was, I grew up there in the 70s and 80s. Stan writes about how, for some people, and again I'll read this, it's hardly surprising that some of our people prefer to stay where they are. Here is another uncomfortable, confronting question. Who says we have to aspire to white Australia's idea of a good life? Sometimes defiance is all we have. For me, that also is a very powerful paragraph, that people feel so helpless.
Yeah. And I think then what's kind of transcending about the book is that he says, well, but at least for me, that's not how it worked out. Anyone who can write that is clearly ridiculously talented. He has transcended that, and he has made a life that's not like that, and he is now able to say, this is where we are from. And it's a very powerful book, I think. So yes, my guess is you're still going to be reading this in 30 years' time, so, I know you've got your name in the front, don't lose it.
Okay. Time for a new consensus fostering Australia's comparative advantages.
Yeah. Your colleague,
you're going to drag that down to the beach?
Yeah, look, your colleague Virginia Trioli was really rude about this on national television, saying, would you ever take that down to the beach?
I would say I would, but I'd ensure that I had a hip flask with me.
So in its defence, it is actually very well written. I will accept the title, Time for a New Consensus, Fostering Australia's Comparative Advantages, is not necessarily what I would have chosen.
Not sexy, no.
But the content is really interesting. Yeah. And it's very well written. It's an easy read, albeit dealing with very difficult concepts, complex concepts. Yeah. And for me, it asks a really good question. So the question is this. If we look at the history of Australia, the first 70, 80 years was what we now describe as the Federation settlement. And we had a consensus amongst politicians and people who did policy and so on that said, look, what we're really trying to do here is we've got a country with high tariff barriers, we're trying to encourage manufacturing, we essentially control migration so that it only comes from basically white places, and we have a highly regulated industrial relations system that means that we will spread whatever benefits there are in the country pretty well. And for 80 years, it didn't work too badly. You know, Australian prosperity went up, and you know the benefits of growth were reasonably well distributed. There were a few minor problems, like the White Australia policy along the way through, but you know, life went on. But that was the consensus, and eventually it ran into the sand in the 70s, and it stopped growing so fast, and Australia really started to fall backwards relative to the rest of the world. And then we saw a new consensus from the 80s under Hawke and Keating, and as many people have quite rightly pointed out, the non-opposition of John Howard. And as a result, we had, you know, what Paul Kelly has written about extensively in terms of that new settlement around, okay, we're going to deregulate the labour market, we're going to float the dollar, we're going to bring down those tariff barriers, we're going to run quite a high level of migration, and it will not just be white migration, instead it will be essentially skilled migration. We'll open the borders to people from all sorts of places, and obligingly Australian productivity went through the roof, and the OECD continues to write up case studies about Australia in the 80s and 90s and just how well it did as a result of that new consensus. Great. So
and as a paradox, now it's holding us back.
Well, or
in a
now, now we're kind of sitting here and going, so what do we do now? And there's concern about the fact that growth is not very fast. There's concern about the political blowback from migration and so on. There is concern that inequality is rising, less so in Australia than elsewhere, but it is rising. All of these concerns and a sneaking suspicion that one of the things going on is that we're still kind of trying to fight the last war of the 1980s, and when the most exciting thing, you know, when the centrepiece of the government's economic package, you know, the thing that's going to drive jobs and growth and be the big thing for the next, you know, two terms, is a corporate tax cut that increases gross national income by 0.6% more than otherwise. Now that's a wee bit difficult to get excited about. You know, growth will be essentially, you know, about, you know, 3 months more than you would have expected over a 20-year period. You know, it's not the kind of thing that I'm going to go to the barricades for. I'm certainly not going to be, you know, nailing things up against the Tiananmen Square, on the Tiananmen Square railings for that one. Yeah. So I think they ask a great question. Do you think they've got the answer right?
I'm not sure that they do, because they focus very much on this comparative advantage, which is basically identifying the areas where Australia could do well and investing our money in building capacity, capability, investing in people to get that know-how. Essentially, it comes down to picking winners.
Yeah, and we haven't been picking winners, or at least not that much. And that's true, but it's not then immediately clear that picking winners is the answer. And I think the other, the thing I like about it is that it's a great thing to argue with. It's one of those things that has literally sat on my desk for most of this year with a whole bunch of comments scrawled in the margin of like, yeah, and then no. And it's something you can argue with. So one of the kind of key things it picks up is this, as you say, this idea of comparative advantage, and the kind of classic Ricardian way that the French economist put this was to say Portugal was better at doing wine than textiles, and so it made sense for them to focus on doing wine. England was better at doing textiles than wine. Let's face it, it was a long time since you drank a good bottle of wine from England, and so it made sense for them to focus on textiles. But as they point out, wine, certainly at the time, was not a very innovative industry, so Portugal wound up more or less going nowhere. Textiles inherently were a more innovative industry in which technology was moving faster, the applications of those technologies were moving faster, and so that set them up for a whole bunch of other industries. So far so good. The conclusion then is, okay, so you don't want to be in primary industries like mining or wine. I'm not so sure about that. I think you don't want to be in industries in which technology is not moving very fast. And in fact, I think people like Andrew Mackenzie and others are right. Technology in mining is moving really fast. You know, go have a look at a real life mine.
Rio Tinto in the West, they've got the big dumpsters with nobody at the wheel at all. They remotely drive in, pick up the loads and drive out.
Other mines in Australia have remote vehicles like that, but there's not even anyone on the controls anywhere else. They're literally completely autonomous. They're like robots. They kind of know what they're supposed to do and they trundle themselves out to the last place that there was blasting, and they kind of pick up as much as they can, and then they kind of trundle their way back, and they dump it where it's kind of going to get picked up for the next stage of the process, and then they go back and do it again. And if they kind of sense, if there's a sensor that says, you know, your tyres are too hot or whatever it might be, then they kind of trundle to the place that, you know, where that gets dealt with, or your tyres are too hot, so then they deliberately do a short load. I mean, you know, this is an industry with, you know, innovating very, very rapidly. And you can see that in the way that a lot of the Australian miners are wound up right at the bottom of the global cost curve, precisely because they're really good at innovating.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that that solves the answer about, well, what is Australia's next consensus?
Yeah.
But it's
No, we're stuck on that. Australia's stuck on that issue. It's like we're swimming through treacle at the moment.
But on the other hand, we're not alone,
Yeah.
because globally growth is not really going anywhere very fast in developed countries. Globally, inequality is increasing, and of course globally that's causing political issues.
Sadly, the answer is not here. But definitely worth a read. And I advocate a hip flask. Now, the next article, When and Why Nationalism Beats Globalism. And I read this. It was published July 10th, and it was written just after Brexit had happened. But I read this the day that Donald Trump was elected president. And a lot of this was just, it was ringing true and, you know, finding answers to it all. It was a terrific read, a really, really good read.
Yeah, so what attracted me about this, and in fact we've had a Jonathan Haidt piece on the list I think about 3 or 4 years ago called Why People Vote Republican. And this essentially is a why people vote for Trump, which is in fact a slightly different question. And what the powerful lens that Haidt brings is he's a psychologist by training. And so his professional discipline is, well, what motivates people to do what they do? What presses their buttons? And his theory in this, and it's a really compelling thesis, and interestingly, not much of this kind of thinking has made it to Australia yet, but it's starting to increasingly be talked about in the United States. His theory is that what's going on is that the very success of globalisation is creating this increasing cultural gulf between cities and more regional areas. And one way of thinking about that is many people from Melbourne have quite close connections with New York, but actually not that many people in Melbourne have close connections with, say, Mildura, let alone somewhere, you know, out in the country, you know, further away from Mildura. And the culture of Melbourne is probably a lot closer to New York than it is to Mildura. And this culture of pulling apart is leading to people in regional areas saying, the culture of my country is not what it used to be. I used to be part of the dominant culture of my country, and I'm not anymore. And when they can feel it slipping away from them like that, they resent it, and then that, of course, shows up in politics big time.
He also talks about how the values and the behaviour of the elites and the way that they talk and act unwittingly is activating authoritarian tendencies in people and in a subset of nationalist groups as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, he talks about this concept of authoritarianism, which, I mean, he explicitly picks up a whole series of academic work that's been done on this. I don't think his article has this, but the way that those authoritarian studies have been done, trying to identify people who are not necessarily conservative, they're authoritarian, and the two concepts are slightly different. And of course, you can't figure out whether someone is authoritarian by asking them, you know, do you think that the government should be basically a repressive fascist regime keeping everyone in check? Funnily enough, people tend to say no to questions like that. But instead, what you can do is ask them, do you think that it is more important for children to be considerate or well behaved? Do you think it is more important for children to be curious or obedient? And the answers to those questions tell you very much whether people are authoritarian, and they correlate frighteningly closely with whether or not people vote for Donald Trump, whether or not they vote for Brexit. And his theory is that people who have those kind of authoritarian attitudes are predisposed to really want to clamp down on things if life goes in a particular direction, and in particular, if they feel that their culture is under threat. And so his argument is that what globalists tend to be doing is talking about difference, talking about the value that people from other cultures bring, talk about the value of internationalism as opposed to nationalism, and that is the precise thing that makes people with authoritarian tendencies very nervous about their future. So, and I think one of the things that's really helpful about this, and indeed he's written a subsequent piece that follows up on this, is it turns out that the way that you frame things really matters. So if you frame things as saying people from other cultures are coming to Australia, and that's great because they bring the richness of their culture and their food and their way of life to Australia, you will provoke highly authoritarian reaction. If you frame it as people from other countries and cultures are coming to Australia and we can all share in the food traditions that they bring, in the literature that they have, that we all can all get something out of, they contribute to the democracy that is Australia, you get a completely different reaction. So it turns out the way that you frame these things really matters. And you can also see how, as has been pointed out, Hillary Clinton ran a campaign in which she was perpetually playing up all of the ethnic groups in the United States except white men. The kind of almost the only category that didn't appear at the convention was essentially white men.
No, in fact, they got dubbed deplorables, didn't they?
Yeah, and not surprisingly, people who fell into that category, particularly because their perception is, well, people like me used to run the country, they get, you get a political reaction, and that's exactly what happened.
How does it fit in with the story that's happening here in Australia? Do you think it partly explains the rise of, we had 23-24% of people gave their first preference to not the major parties?
That's right. So the short answer is yes, there's lots of parallels, and indeed those preferences for non-major parties were much higher in regional areas and much lower in central business districts of large cities. And there's kind of, perfect spectrum in between.
Goat cheese circle, as it's become known.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's in fact, it's more like a dartboard. It's kind of like dark in the centre of the CBD, and then it just kind of goes out from there. And there's also no question that this vote for minor parties is increasing over time. But I think it's also a mistake to say, oh, this is all about Pauline Hanson. It's not. It's all about essentially everybody else. So even in Queensland, Pauline Hanson and One Nation Party were comprehensively outpolled by all others, who got less than 3% of the vote in any state in the country. And that's true when you go and look at individual electorates or polling booths. This minor party vote is extremely splintered. Typically, with the exception of South Australia and Nick Xenophon, it goes to all sorts of different parties, which I suspect even you would struggle to know the names of. And even some of them, you would be surprised. So the sex and marijuana parties, which effectively ran an alliance at the last election, actually don't fit into that all other category. They did get more than 3% of the vote in some states. So it was incredibly splintered. Yes, that's exactly what's going on, and I think some of the motivations that lay behind Trump and the sorts of things that Jonathan Haidt's talking about in When and Why Nationalism Beats Globalism, exactly the kind of things that are going on here. The biggest difference, of course, being that Australia is far more of the population lives in the cities.
Cities, that's right.
So there are many more globalists in Australia than there are nationalists, certainly relative to the United States, where far more of the population lives in relatively regional areas, and the same is true of the United Kingdom. You know, we think of, well, but London's the kind of big city that dominates the United Kingdom. Yeah, but it's actually less than 10% of the population, whereas Sydney's pushing 20% of the Australian population.
Excellent. Shall we move on to our next one?
Indeed.
The Life Project. Helen Pearson. Hands up those who've taken part in any kind of survey in the last 5 years. Lots of hands. Have you been willing and happy participants, or sort of begrudgingly taken part? Hands up who have been willing participants and happy to do it. About half. This amazing book is about all the cohort studies in the United Kingdom. The first one got underway in the 1940s when the Brits were really quite worried that the birth rate there was in decline, and there were real concerns that this might lead to the extinction of the empire. So they decided, a bunch of scientists, you know, and with funding from the government, decided to go out and talk to, or, you know, get all the details of all the babies born in a particular week and ask all sorts of questions to the mothers. And they picked one particular week in 1946, March 1946. A 31-year-old doctor led this study, and he set about collecting all the information about these babies. And funnily enough, because it was 1946, they actually captured the baby boom at this particular point. But what information ended up coming from these cohort studies and the studies that followed thereafter, it's been absolutely fascinating. I found this was the surprise read for me out of everything that you gave me in the list. I really thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'm delighted to hear it. I mean, it is, if there's a Wonks book on the list, this is the Wonks book, right? And I think for Wonks, you know, one of the things it shows is the way that traditionally most public policy has tended to be cross-sectional. It looks like the census. We go and ask a whole bunch of people questions at a point in time, and then we can say, okay, at this point in time, people who tended to be like this also tended to be like that. Well, the problem is that gives you lots of correlation and very little causation. You can't tell what caused what. The beauty of a longitudinal study like this one, because of course they followed these babies, well, who eventually of course grew up, they're still following them.
Still following them.
70 years later, is that you can start to infer causation a lot more often. When such and such happened to people in their lives, such and such tended to happen to them later on.
These studies have come up with findings that we now take for granted, like women who drink when they're pregnant, low-weight babies, parents that read to their children when they're quite young, how they, you know, their educational attainments are far superior to anyone else. But it also points out, you know, the inequality problem still exists. But what was also fascinating was the absolute passion that some of these researchers had, that some of them were prepared to mortgage their own homes to make sure that these studies continued.
Yeah, we don't think of social science as heroic, do we? But it is, right?
It is. It's fascinating. It's so important, and it's such a shame. Like they also, Helen Pearson also points out that the last major cohort study that got underway, 2012 with the Olympics, they ended up, the government cancelled the funding in 2015 because, you know, it was too expensive.
And of course, you can't go backwards.
Right.
These studies, they're only useful if they've been done, and if it hasn't been done in the past, that's just data you haven't got. Right. The other thing that's, I think for me, you know, it is truly heroic. You know, this study was started by someone aged 31 in 1946, and of course there was a point at which he had to hand it over because he was going to die. And he did. As you tend to when you're kind of like that old. And so it's the kind of the heroism of people who've then picked up the ball and are still running with it, because the participants are still only, inverted commas, only 70. Many of them are going to live for another 20 years, and we will learn things in the next 20 years.
And at the time, you know, they asked all sorts of weird questions that, you know, they could never possibly know just how significant those questions were. Like the first survey was, how many petticoats did you have to buy, and how many rubber sheets that you bought for baby and all that. And like, they discovered that, you know, there was a great gap between wealthy mothers and poor off, and it led to maternity payments, and it eventually led to maternity, maternity leave. So the findings that have come out of these various studies have been important not only to the UK but the world over, and I reckon it was a great read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think beautifully titled. I mean, it's the Life Project. This has changed people's lives.
Yeah.
You know, people are living better lives because of the insight we got from this work, and without this work, we might well not have known.
Yeah. And it also has lovely little vignettes through it too of people who've managed to break out of, their demography as destiny. They were born in poor families. They didn't have a toilet inside the house. There was domestic violence. People who've done really, really well, who forced themselves. They left school young, but they went to night school, and they've beaten the odds and they've done quite well. So I thought it was great.
Great. So, did you like Ali Smith and Autumn?
I loved Ali Smith and Autumn, but initially, this is a terrific book. This was, and what's amazed me is that such beautiful writing could happen in such a short time frame. This is being billed as the first Brexit novel, and Ali Smith had decided that she wanted to write 4 books, one titled after each season, and this one, she'd formed a lot of it before Brexit happened, but when Brexit happened, she asked her publisher if she could have one more month, please, to sort of finesse and finish things. And it was fantastic. The first chapter, I thought, hello, what's this book going to be about? Do I need my hip flask now? But this, I've learned so much. There's just so much in this. There's Brexit, there's feminism, there's art. There's something for everyone, I thought.
But I found it a book that's against this background of Brexit and the very unpleasant politics that's gone with it. I think it's true of British and the United States and Australia and heaven knows any number of other countries. Our public debate has become particularly uncivil and not very nice some of the time. People are playing the man a lot more than they're playing the ball some of the time. Lots of things that you just look at and think, you don't have to say that. And you can maybe blame social media and you can blame all sorts of things, but it's not very nice. And then we've also got, a whole series of things that are much more authoritarian than they used to be. And Australia has passed its fair share of authoritarian legislation over the last 5 years, and some of it's not being used in ways that are very nice. And the same thing is going on in the United Kingdom. And at the same time, these incredibly beautiful stories about people and their relationships and their human relationships that just transcend all of that.
Yeah. There's a lovely passage. This story, it's about a 31-year-old woman, Elizabeth Demand. She's a contract lecturer. I think she's out of work at the moment. There's a fantastic couple of scenes where she's in a post office waiting for her number to be called up. She's applying for a passport, and when she gets to the front counter, she's told that no, her photo is unacceptable because the eyes aren't quite right.
There's a lovely line in the book, this is not fiction, this is the post office.
And I loved this particular sentence too about after Brexit. It is like democracy is a bottle someone can threaten to smash and do a bit of damage with. And she also talks about when the result happened, all across the country there was misery and rejoicing. All across the country, what had happened whipped about by itself as if a live electric wire had snapped off a pylon in a storm and was whipping about in the air above the trees, the roofs and the traffic. All across the country, people felt as if it was the wrong thing. All across the country, people felt it was the right thing. All across the country, people felt they were really lost. All across the country, people felt they'd really won, and that was it.
Yeah. And so it goes from that, the kind of big picture of politics and how people react to politics to the incredibly personal. So one of the bits I loved was Elizabeth's mother is not very nice, actually.
Very nice at all.
And Elizabeth's mother is much cheerier this week, thank God. This is because she has received an email telling her she has been selected to appear on a TV program called The Golden Gavel, where members of the public pit their wits against celebrities and antiques experts by trawling around antiques shops on a fixed budget and trying to buy the thing which in the end will raise the most money at auction. It's as if the angel Gabriel has appeared at the door of her mother's life, kneeled down, bowed his head, and told her in a shop full of junk, somewhere among all the thousands and thousands of abandoned, broken, outdated, tarnished, sold on, long gone and forgotten things, there is something of much greater worth than anyone realizes, and the person we have chosen to trust to unearth it from the dross of time and history is you. And that play between those two registers is what the book's all about, and it's just great.
It is great. The other thing that's great is the relationship with her elderly neighbour.
Yeah.
And by, in the contemporary time that it's written, Daniel is 101 and he's in a care facility in his autumn days. He's on his way out. But it's beautiful, it's tender, and again, the mother is really suspicious of this relationship. Why is my daughter seeing this old bloke? But it is just beautiful, the stories that they tell one another. There's so much in this book. There are so many redeeming things in this book that make up for the elements that aren't very redeeming in the mother. But I loved it. It was really good.
Great.
Yeah.
So no hip flask required?
No hip flask required for this one.
Great. Well, you might need a hip flask for some of the what comes next. So, for the Prime Minister's reading list, we have to take into account the fact that the Prime Minister, may not necessarily be quite as excited about about policy as people at Grattan Institute. But we do also construct a wonks list every year. You know the derivation of the word wonk?
No, I don't.
So what does it spell backwards? It's to know it backwards. Or at least that's one theory. Anyway, so what we've got on for wonks, and there may be one or two people here in the audience for wonks, we've got a piece on secular drivers of the global real interest rate. Now, I realise that makes Tom Bentley and Jonathan West seem positively, risque.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, for people in policy, one of the biggest questions we've got at the moment is, why are interest rates at their lowest in 5,000 years, and why are they staying there? Why is global growth so slow? What is going on? You go and talk to people who study this stuff for a living, and they haven't got very good answers to those questions. This is the staff working paper number 571 from the Bank of England, but it's clearly one that they lavished even more attention on than normal. It's incredibly good. You go and talk to economists anywhere and they say, this is the thing you've got to read. It's pretty hard work, but on the other hand, it's the best answers we've got to those questions, which are probably the most difficult questions we've got in terms of our economic policy at the moment. Then we have a piece by Marcia Langton or edited by Marcia Langton and Megan Davis. It's Our Country, a whole series of different essays by Indigenous people talking about what their view is on constitutional recognition and reform. And they're all well written. They've all got something to say. It'd be fair to say that they've got very different things to say and they don't agree with each other at all a lot of the time. But this is a debate that we're clearly going to have over the next couple of years, and this will give you a better idea about where people are coming from in the debate than many other things. Then we have Ezra Klein, an article, you can pull it down online from Vox, called Technology is Changing How We Live, but it Needs to Change How We Work. The whole kind of meme out there at the moment is, technology is changing really fast. What does this mean? Does this explain why a measured productivity growth is so slow? This is a very thoughtful article about what's going on with that whole game of technology change. Peter Varghese, who was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Trade until recently in Australia, this was his parting speech as he stepped down.
It was a cracker.
It is a cracker. And he talks about institutions and how important they are and how we mess with them at our peril and how valuable those institutions are, how hard it is to build them, how easy it is to destroy them, what a big difference they make when we get them right. It's not very long, but I think it's a very powerful reminder of just how much all that stuff matters, particularly for people who spend a lot of time in policy worrying about economics. So I think really helpful to be kind of pushed back and reminded the lawyers and institutional design, all of that stuff matters as well. Then we have a book by someone who at one stage was a Grattan staff member. We have a very hard rule that no one who's a Grattan staff member can have something on the list, but Peter Mayers was at Grattan, and he's written a fantastic book called Not Quite Australian, which is about our migration program and the temporary migration program we have, which effectively means that you can be a temporary migrant in Australia for a very, very, very long period of time. Indeed, for a lifetime, you can be a temporary migrant. We've created this kind of half-world of migration, as he puts it, not quite Australian, and all of the policy issues that is creating. It's very thoughtful, as you would expect of a Grattan staff member. It's deeply buried in the numbers, but it's also a very human book as well, understanding how this affects real people and what we might do from a policy perspective. And then finally, a book called $1 Trillion Baby by Paul Cleary, How Norway Beat the Oil Giants and Won a Lasting Fortune. So Norway, as we know today, effectively nationalised its oil industry, or largely nationalised it, and they did very well out of that, and they have built a vast sovereign wealth fund, indeed so large that the biggest question in Norwegian public policy is what do we do with the sovereign wealth fund money? Because it is now supporting so much of the Norwegian budget. Clearly a very different strategy to what happened in Australia, a very different outcome, and I think an interesting challenge about, well, how did the Norwegians make that decision? Why did they make that decision? Was it a good idea? And implicitly, you know, Australia's just been through an extraordinarily large mining boom. Chances are it will not be the last mining boom in history. Do we want to make different choices next time? And I think it asks that question in very thoughtful ways. So a little extra reading for, you know, people with 2 hip flasks.
I won't need 2 hip flasks. I lived for a time in Norway, so this is fascinating stuff.
Terrific. So that's lots from us. We should just throw very briefly to the audience. Is anyone got a burning question? There's a burning one up there, so why don't we go there first, please? Thank you. Yeah, it's coming your way. It's all right. Don't panic. Please, please keep it short.
Can you tell me what you think our Prime Minister will learn from the one novel on the list, apart from he may get some joy and happiness, which he hasn't had much this year?
Thank you. It's a great question. Look, I think the beauty of novels is that they put you inside the head of someone else, if they're well written, and this one is. And so it's an act of imagination that enables you to see the world from someone else's point of view, different to you. Walk a mile, indeed many more than 1 mile in their shoes. And I think that that's valuable for any politician, to truly understand where other people with other backgrounds are coming from. And indeed, I guess that's actually a bit of a theme of this year's list. I hadn't thought about that, but you know, Jonathan Haidt's piece is about that. The book on China is about that. These are all things that kind of push you into walking a couple of miles in someone else's shoes. So I think it's about that. And as Sabra was saying, it enables you to think about both sides of the Brexit debate, that there were some people who were furious and some people who were delighted, and making you think through, okay, so what was it like to be in both kinds of people's shoes, and what was it like to be in the shoes of people who actually were really in neither but had to live their lives anyhow.
Yeah, and I just want to add there, interestingly, the Prime Minister has said in the past week, and I hope I'm not breaking confidences here, but he insisted that he's been the happiest he's ever been.
Next question. Anything that you wish was on the list and we have outrageously omitted, please. Thank you.
Thank you. You've managed to go a whole hour without actually mentioning the environment and climate change as one of the great moral issues of our time. Is there nothing worth reading on this subject?
I think there's obviously lots of things worth reading on that topic. We try and keep the list manageable. That gives us 6 books or articles. And I guess we have had things about that in the past. I guess we didn't see anything this year that, in the way that I think these pieces did, really made me look and others at Grattan think, oh, I haven't thought about that problem that way. I mean, I think one of the problems with climate change is the ground has now been so thoroughly dug over. It's really hard to say something, genuinely fresh and new about it that you haven't read somewhere already. These pieces, I think, all one way or another had something that you look at and think, I have not thought about that before. And it's one of the things we're really looking for in this list, is things that you keep coming back to over the year. That's one of the real underlying criteria is, so what's the thing that I keep telling everyone they've got to read, because otherwise they won't understand what I'm talking about?
Interestingly, though, I think I did read something on the weekend, some of the books that Polly's will be reading this week, over the summer break. And one of the books that the Prime Minister did nominate was Tim Winton's Island Home. And I think, from memory, climate change is part of that book. Also, reconciliation with Indigenous Australia is another sort of feature in that book, and reconciling our past. So hopefully the Prime Minister will take a lot away from that. And that's one big issue that, politically Australia will be grappling with next year, is what do we do with the question of Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. We've got the various forums that are happening at the moment, and it certainly looks like we are definitely not going to make the 50th anniversary target of having it next year, but it'll be, how do we tackle that issue? How, and the Indigenous community, it's not one disparate voice, it's not one voice, there are many different voices with many different views and attitudes as to what should be happening with that.
Yeah.
So.
And indeed, that's the point of the book that we've got on the Wonks list, is precisely you can see just how broad that set of Indigenous views is. One more. Anything else that anyone desperately wants on the list? No? I'm delighted that this year we've done such a good job. Well, in that case, let me wrap up by thanking a few people, says he, desperately looking for his list to make sure he doesn't forget anyone. First of all, thank you to the people at Grattan Institute who do all of the hard work of assembling the long list, trying to keep the whole exercise manageable, writing it up, helping me to choose. As I said, it's ultimately a thoroughly totalitarian exercise, but it's one in which it's, I like to think, a very beneficent dictator who takes lots of advice. So thank you to Kate Griffiths and Lucille Danks and Brendan Coates, who did a huge amount of work putting this together and really finding, I think, some brilliant gems. Thank you too for a very large number of members of Grattan staff who read, one way or another, most of the things that showed up on the extremely long list, and therefore, by definition, by and large, read things that did not make the cut, and which were therefore, by definition, nothing like as well written or interesting as the things that were on the list. And it's hard work reading books that are not well written and not worth reading, or less worth reading. So huge thanks to them. Thanks to Tom Bentley, who's in the audience somewhere here, I think. Yes, over there. Thank you for coming, Tom. It's great to have you here, and thank you for your contribution to the list. Thank you to Sarah Slade and the library staff, obviously, for tonight, as well as the ongoing relationship with Grattan Institute. And also thank you to all of the Grattan staff who've been doing, and library staff behind the scenes who've been making tonight a success. Finally, we're about to, or second last thing actually, we're about to finish up here, and then there will be drinks and nibblies served through that way. I dare say if you follow the crowd, you will find them. And if you follow the crowd towards the drinks and nibblies but don't want the drinks and nibblies, that's because you want to buy one of the books. And Readings will have a stand where the drinks and nibblies are, where you can buy any of the books we've been talking about tonight. The articles you can download for yourselves when you get home. So please do join us in the courtyard immediately after. And then that leads me only to thank once again Sabra. As always, it's a complete pleasure to talk to you. It's much more fun when we're actually in the same room rather than talking down the barrels of cameras from remote places. Thank you for all the work you've put into reading all of the stuff on the list. Thank you for your deep insight into what was there, and best of all, possible luck for Radio National next year.
Thank you very much. This will make me a better journalist at the end of the day, so thank you.
Oh, thank you very, very much. And thank you all for coming. Thank you and good night.